It is in the restless streets of medieval Florence, amid the clang of blacksmiths and the rustle of market stalls, that we first hear the echo of Dante Alighieri's restless spirit. The city of his birth, a thriving republic in the late 13th century, was anything but tranquil. The very air seemed charged with the tension of two great factions, the Guelphs, who championed the papal authority, and the Ghibellines, who upheld the imperial claim of the Holy Roman Empire. This binary conflict, more than a mere political rivalry, was a crucible that forged the intellectual temperament of a generation. To understand Dante, we must first picture a Florence where civic pride was matched by civic violence, where the council chambers echoed with heated debates about the nature of power, and where the streets themselves could become a battlefield at the drop of a banner. The Guelphs, in turn, were not a monolithic group. By the 1280s, they had split into the Black Guelphs, who aligned closely with papal interests, and the White Guelphs, who sought a more autonomous municipal governance. Dante, born in 1265 to a modest but respectable Florentine family, grew up under the shadow of this schism. His early education, likely conducted in the vernacular and Latin schools of the city, introduced him to the works of the Church Fathers, to the logic of the scholastics, and to the poetry of the troubadours. Yet it was the political turbulence that left the deepest imprint. When the White Guelphs were expelled from Florence in 1301 by the papal legate, the very same year that Dante was forced into exile, the young poet's world was torn apart. The exile was not a mere inconvenience, it was a profound rupture that reshaped his perception of justice, authority, and the soul's journey toward the divine. The intellectual climate of Dante's Italy was also saturated with the currents of scholasticism, a method of learning that sought to reconcile faith with reason. At the heart of this movement stood Thomas Aquinas, whose Summa Theologica attempted to harmonize the teachings of Aristotle with Christian doctrine. Though Aquinas would not publish his magnum opus until after Dante's death, his ideas were already circulating in the university halls of Paris and Bologna, filtered through the commentaries of scholars like Albertus Magnus. Dante absorbed these currents not as a passive recipient but as an active participant. In his Divine Comedy, he invokes the Aristotelian hierarchy of being, the Thomistic distinction between essence and existence, and the Augustinian notion of the ordered love of God. He does not merely echo these ideas, he weaves them into a poetic architecture that reflects a medieval worldview striving for synthesis. Aristotle, filtered through the Arabic philosopher Averroes, had re-entered the Latin West in the 12th century, bringing with him a renewed emphasis on empirical observation and logical deduction. Averroes' commentaries on the Nicomachean Ethics and the Politics offered a model of rational inquiry that appealed to the educated elite of Dante's time. Dante, ever the cosmopolitan, was aware of this intellectual heritage. He references Aristotle explicitly in the Paradiso when he writes, "The first of all sciences that is the most noble, the highest, the most universal, is the science of the divine." Here, Dante is not merely praising a deity. He is invoking the Aristotelian concept of the unmoved mover while simultaneously aligning it with the Christian God. This duality illustrates how he navigated the tension between pagan philosophy and Christian revelation, a tension that defined much of the scholastic enterprise. Yet the Augustinian tradition loomed even larger over Dante's imagination. Augustine's City of God offered a stark contrast between the earthly city, riddled with sin and corruption, and the heavenly city, a realm of perfect justice. Dante internalized this dichotomy, structuring his comedy as a journey from the darkness of the Inferno, the earthly city of sin, to the luminous heights of the Paradiso, the celestial city of divine order. Augustine's famous line, "Our hearts are restless until they find rest in you," resonates throughout the poem, echoing in the pilgrim's yearning for divine communion. In the Purgatorio, the soul's ascent mirrors Augustine's belief in the progressive purification of the soul, an ascent that is both moral and intellectual. Two concrete episodes in Dante's life illustrate how these intellectual and political forces shaped his worldview. The first is the bitter episode of his exile. When the Black Guelphs, backed by Pope Boniface VII, seized Florence, they declared Dante a public enemy, sentencing him to death in absentia. Forced to wander from Verona to Bologna, from Ferrara to Ravenna, Dante experienced the precariousness of political fortune. This personal dislocation sharpened his awareness of the fragility of human institutions and deepened his conviction that true justice transcended earthly politics. In the Inferno, he places the corrupt papal officials, such as Pope Nicholas III, in the circle of the Simoniacs, a clear indictment of the papacy's moral decay. The very act of assigning contemporary figures to their appropriate contrapasso, a punishment that reflects the nature of their sin, demonstrates Dante's belief that moral order is immutable, even when human law fails. The second example lies in the intricate political allegories woven throughout the Divine Comedy. In Canto V of the Inferno, Dante meets Francesca da Rimini, whose tragic love affair becomes a cautionary tale about the dangers of uncontrolled passion, a theme that resonates with Augustine's warnings about the disorder of the heart. Yet the allegory extends further. Francesca's story is also a commentary on the political alliances that bind and betray. The lovers' illicit union mirrors the clandestine pacts between the Guelphs and Ghibellines, alliances that often collapsed under the weight of personal ambition. Through these narratives, Dante transforms personal misfortune into a universal moral lesson, illustrating how the private and the public intertwine in the tapestry of human destiny. To bring these abstractions into sharper focus, let us pause and consider the papal election of 1300, a turning point that reverberated across Italy. After the death of Pope Boniface VIII, the College of Cardinals convened in Perugia, a city already fraught with Guelph-Ghibelline tensions. The election of Pope Benedict XI was marked by intense negotiation, compromise, and some say, outright bribery. Dante, still a young poet, observed the machinations with a critical eye. He would later embed this experience in the Paradiso, where the Pope occupies the sphere of the sun, a place reserved for those who illuminate the world with wisdom. Yet Dante's placement is not uncritical. He notes that even the highest clerics are subject to the same human frailties that beset any earthly ruler. This nuanced portrayal reflects his deep engagement with the political realities of his era, filtered through a philosophical lens that seeks the divine order beneath the chaos. Another vivid anecdote comes from Dante's encounter with the Florentine poet Guido Cavalcanti, a close friend and fellow member of the Dolce Stil Novo movement. Cavalcanti, known for his austere verses on love and loss, shared with Dante an intense debate on the nature of the soul. According to contemporary accounts, the two poets once spent an evening in the garden of the Palazzo dei Priori, discussing whether the soul's immortality could be proven through reason alone or required divine revelation. Cavalcanti, a staunch Aristotelian, argued that the soul's rational capacity was sufficient proof of its eternal nature. Dante, influenced by Augustine, countered that reason, while valuable, must be guided by faith to reach its full truth. This dialogue, though lost to history, left an imprint on Dante's own synthesis of reason and faith, a synthesis that would become the backbone of his comedy. In examining the intellectual lineage that informs Dante, we cannot overlook the influence of the Augustinian notion of ordered love. Augustine taught that love, when rightly directed toward God, organizes the cosmos in a harmonious hierarchy. Dante adopts this principle in the Paradiso when he describes the love that moves the sun and the other stars. The love that moves the sun and the other stars. This line, perhaps the most quoted from the entire poem, encapsulates a worldview where love is both the engine of celestial motion and the moral compass for human action. It is a poetic distillation of a philosophical doctrine that had been debated in the halls of Paris for centuries. Yet some scholars argue that Dante should be read solely as a literary genius, not as a philosopher. They point to his masterful use of terza rima, his vivid imagery, and his narrative flair as evidence that his primary aim was artistic, not doctrinal. To this, we might respond by recalling the very structure of the Divine Comedy. The poem is not a mere story. It is an intricate system of allegory, numerology, and theological argument. The three canticles, Inferno, Purgatorio, Paradiso, correspond to the threefold division of the soul in scholastic thought. The intellect, the will, and the affect. The number 9, which recurs in the 9 circles of hell, the 9 terraces of purgatory, and the 9 spheres of heaven, mirrors the 9 orders of angels described by Pseudo-Dionysius, a figure whose work was central to medieval metaphysics. These structural choices betray a mind deeply engaged with philosophical concepts, not merely a poet seeking aesthetic effect. Another counterargument suggests that Dante's work is a personal vendetta, a catalogue of enemies punished for their political transgressions. Indeed, the Inferno is populated with contemporaries, Bacca degli Abbati, Filippo Argenti, even the poet's own uncle, who suffered grotesque fates. Critics claim that Dante used the poem as a means to settle scores, reducing philosophy to a vehicle for revenge. Yet this view overlooks the broader moral architecture that undergirds the poem. Each punishment is not random. It follows the principle of contrapasso, a concept rooted in both Aristotle's notion of poetic justice and Augustine's belief in divine retribution. The placement of a sinner in a particular circle reflects a rational analysis of the sin's nature, its impact on the soul, and its relation to the cosmic order. In this sense, Dante's personal grievances are subsumed within a universal moral framework that transcends petty vendetta. To deepen our appreciation of Dante's philosophical ambition, we must consider how his ideas reverberated through later humanist thought. Petrarch, often hailed as the father of the Renaissance humanism, admired Dante's linguistic daring but critiqued his theological rigidity. In a letter to a friend, Petrarch wrote, "Dante, you have shown us the heavens, yet you have bound them in the chains of scholastic doctrine." This tension reflects a shift from the medieval synthesis of faith and reason toward a more secular appreciation of classical antiquity. Nonetheless, Petrarch's own canzoniere bears the imprint of Dante's emphasis on the soul's ascent, suggesting a continuity even as the intellectual climate evolved. The dialogue continues into the early modern period with Niccolò Machiavelli, whose discourses on Livy examine the republican virtues of ancient Rome and the dangers of factionalism, issues that echo Dante's own concerns about the Guelph-Ghibelline strife. Machiavelli, while often portrayed as a cynic, shares with Dante a belief in the necessity of moral order for political stability. In the discourses, Machiavelli writes, "A state that lacks virtue is like a ship without a rudder." Dante, in the Paradiso, similarly argues that the soul's virtue directs it toward the divine light. Though their methodologies differ, Machiavelli's empirical analysis versus Dante's allegorical vision, their works converge on the idea that ethical conduct underpins the health of the polis. Modern political philosophy also finds a lineage in Dante's thought. Contemporary scholars of deliberative democracy, such as Eugen Habermas, invoke the concept of the public sphere, a space where rational discourse can shape collective decisions. Dante's Convivio, a treatise on philosophy and politics, proposes a similar ideal, a community where scholars and citizens engage in dialogue to discern truth. In Convivio, he writes, "The true purpose of learning is to bring men together in the pursuit of the common good." This sentiment anticipates the Enlightenment's emphasis on reasoned debate, demonstrating how Dante's medieval concerns anticipate modern democratic ideals. Let us now turn to the concrete ways in which Dante's philosophical synthesis manifests in the Divine Comedy. In the Inferno, the very architecture of hell reflects a rational order. The circles are arranged according to the gravity of sin, a hierarchy that mirrors Aristotle's great chain of being. The further one descends, the more the sin deviates from the rational nature of humanity. This ordering is not arbitrary. It is a philosophical statement that sin is a distortion of the soul's natural inclination toward the good. When Dante meets the heretics trapped in burning tombs, he observes that they are the ones who denied the immortality of the soul, and thus they are forever sealed in a tomb that pretends to be eternal. Here, Dante employs the scholastic argument that the soul's immortality is a necessary premise for moral accountability. In the Purgatorio, the mountain of purgatory serves as a symbol of the soul's gradual ascent toward perfection, a concept rooted in Augustine's view of the soul's journey through stages of love. The terraces correspond to the 7 deadly sins, each purged through a specific penitential act. When Dante encounters the proud, he witnesses them carrying heavy stones, a physical manifestation of the burden of hubris. This image echoes Aquinas' assertion that pride inflates the soul, weighing it down from reaching divine grace. The poetic justice of the terraces illustrates how Dante's imagination is informed by theological doctrine, turning abstract principles into vivid, experiential reality. The Paradiso culminates in a vision of the celestial spheres, each governed by a different order of angels, as delineated by Pseudo-Dionysius. Dante's ascent through the spheres of the moon, Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, the fixed stars, and finally the primum mobile, reflects the medieval cosmology that placed Earth at the center of a harmonious universe. Yet Dante does not merely describe this structure, he interprets it philosophically. In Canto XXXII he declares, "The love that moves the sun and the other stars." This line encapsulates a metaphysical principle. Love is the fundamental cause of motion, a concept that unites the Aristotelian physics of the mover with the Augustinian theology of divine love. It is a poetic articulation of the philosophical synthesis that dominated the intellectual climate of his time. To further illustrate the depth of Dante's philosophical engagement, consider his treatment of free will versus divine foreknowledge. In Paradiso Canto X, Dante converses with St. Thomas Aquinas, who explains that God's knowledge does not negate human freedom because divine knowledge is not temporal, it exists outside of time. Dante responds, "If God knows the future, how can we be responsible for our choices?" Aquinas replies, "God sees all possibilities, but he does not compel the soul. The soul acts freely within the scope of divine knowledge." This dialogue mirrors the scholastic debate on predestination and liberum arbitrium, showing Dante's willingness to grapple with complex theological issues within a poetic framework. The political allegories embedded in the comedy also serve as a critique of contemporary governance. In Inferno Canto XXI, the usurper Gianni Schicchi is punished in the circle of falsifiers for his deceitful manipulation of wills. Dante's condemnation of Schicchi reflects a broader anxiety about the erosion of legal integrity in Florence, where powerful families often bent the law to their advantage. By placing Schicchi among the falsifiers, Dante asserts that the perversion of justice is a sin that threatens the very fabric of the Republic. This moral stance aligns with the Augustinian view that a just society must be rooted in divine law, a principle that resonates with later humanist calls for civic virtue. The personal dimension of Dante's exile also informs his philosophical outlook on justice. In Purgatorio Canto III, he meets the soul of Manfred, the illegitimate son of Emperor Frederick II, who died in battle. Manfred, despite his political transgressions, is granted a place in purgatory because he repented before death. Dante's empathy for Manfred reveals his belief that redemption is possible even for those who have been politically ostracized, a view that challenges the notion that justice is solely retributive. This nuanced perspective anticipates modern restorative justice theories, which emphasize healing and reconciliation over punishment alone. The influence of Dante's thought can be traced through the Renaissance and beyond. Petrarch's sonnets, though more personal in tone, echo Dante's preoccupation with the soul's ascent toward the divine. Petrarch writes, "In the quiet of night, I seek the light that guides my heart," a sentiment that mirrors Dante's nocturnal pilgrimage through the dark wood. Yet Petrarch diverges by emphasizing individual introspection over communal allegory, reflecting the shift from medieval collectivism to Renaissance individualism. Machiavelli, writing a century after Dante, offers a more pragmatic view of political power, yet he cannot escape the shadow of Dante's moral order. In The Prince, Machiavelli advises rulers to appear virtuous while acting ruthlessly when necessary. Dante, by contrast, insists that true virtue cannot be feigned. It must be rooted in genuine love for the divine and for the common good. This tension between appearance and essence underscores a dialogue across centuries about the nature of political morality. In contemporary political philosophy, scholars such as Michael Sandel invoke the concept of the common good, reminiscent of Dante's emphasis on communal salvation. Sandel argues that markets cannot be the sole arbiter of social value, echoing Dante's critique of materialism and corruption. The Divine Comedy thus remains a living text, its moral and philosophical insights reverberating through debates about justice, governance, and the role of the individual within the polis. Turning now to the primary sources, let us hear the story of Dante Alighieri's theological imagination begins not in the bustling streets of Florence, but in the quiet chambers of medieval thought, where the flicker of candlelight illuminated the great synthesis of faith and reason. Imagine a scholar seated at a wooden desk, the weight of a leather-bound Summa Theologica resting beside a copy of Pseudo-Dionysius's mystical theology, each page a bridge between the celestial and the earthly. Dante, a poet in a political exile, walked that bridge with a purpose that was both personal and universal, to map the soul's journey through a cosmos that was at once ordered by Aristotelian physics and animated by Christian doctrine. He did not simply inherit a cosmology, he reshaped it, weaving together the hierarchical spheres of the heavens, the moral gradations of sin, and the luminous promise of divine union. To understand this synthesis, we must first glimpse the intellectual climate of the 13th and early 14th centuries. Thomas Aquinas, whose Summa Theologica would become the cornerstone of scholastic theology, argued that reason and revelation are not opponents but partners. He wrote, "Grace does not destroy nature, but perfects it," a sentence that reverberates through Dante's verses as an affirmation that the rational order of the universe is a conduit for divine grace. Aquinas' integration of Aristotle's physics and metaphysics into a Christian framework offered a map of the cosmos that was both mathematically precise and spiritually resonant. In the Summa, Aquinas describes the celestial spheres as perfect, immutable, and moving in accordance with the divine will, a notion that Dante would later translate into the concentric circles of his Inferno and the radiant layers of the Paradiso. Yet Aquinas was not the only guide on this journey. The Via Negativa, or apophatic tradition, articulated by Pseudo-Dionysius, taught that the divine essence is ultimately ineffable, beyond all human concepts. In his mystical theology, Dionysius declares, God is beyond all being and therefore beyond all being's comprehension. This paradox, knowing God by denying what he is, found a subtle echo in Dante's description of the Empyrean, the highest heaven where the very light of God is said to be beyond all sight, beyond all thought. The Empyrean is not a place that can be fully described. It is a mystery that the pilgrim can only approach through love, a love that, as Dante writes, is the very light that makes all things visible. The tension between the apophatic and the cataphatic, between what can be said and what must remain unsaid, creates the theological tension that drives the entire structure of the Divine Comedy. Let us now turn to the first concrete example of this synthesis, the 9 circles of hell. In the medieval mind, sin was not a monolithic concept but a graded hierarchy, each offense corresponding to a particular disorder of the soul. Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics had already classified virtues and vices, and the Church had adopted this moral taxonomy, aligning it with the notion of contrapasso, the principle that punishment fits the crime. Dante's hell, therefore, is not a chaotic abyss but a meticulously ordered system. The first circle, limbo, houses the virtuous pagans, those who lacked baptism but lived according to reason. Here Dante places Homer, Horace, and Ovid, reflecting the Aristotelian respect for human rationality even while acknowledging the necessity of divine grace. As we descend, each circle corresponds to a specific sin. Lust in the second, gluttony in the third, greed in the fourth, anger in the fifth, heresy in the sixth, violence in the seventh, fraud in the eighth, and treachery in the ninth. This arrangement mirrors the medieval 7 deadly sins while expanding them into a more nuanced taxonomy that includes subcategories of fraud and treachery, echoing Aquinas' detailed analysis of deceit and perjury in the Summa. In the 8th circle, the male bulge, Dante presents 10 bulges, each a specialized pit for a particular form of fraud, from seducers to falsifiers. This intricate design demonstrates how Dante internalized Aquinas' view that sin is a disorder of the rational will, a perversion of the natural order that Aristotle described as a failure to achieve the telos, the ultimate purpose of the soul. The second example, the Empyrean, offers a stark contrast to the infernal architecture. While hell is a descending spiral of decreasing light, the Empyrean is an ascending sphere of pure love, a realm that transcends even the celestial spheres of the angels. In Paradiso, Dante ascends through the 9 planetary spheres: Moon, Mercury, Venus, Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, the fixed stars, and the primum mobile, each representing a different facet of divine wisdom and virtue. The final, the Empyrean, is not a sphere in the geometric sense but a light beyond light, a place where the love that moves the sun and the other stars culminates. Here, Dante channels the apophatic tradition. The Empyrean is described in terms of what it is not, no longer a place of form but of pure love. It is a metaphysical endpoint that reflects Augustine's vision of the city of God, a realm where the soul is fully united with the divine will, free from the constraints of earthly categories. Now consider the first anecdote, the vision that allegedly sparked Dante's cosmic imagination. In 1300, during his exile from Florence, Dante found himself in the Tuscan countryside, near the small town of San Miniato. According to a later tradition recorded by Boccaccio, a sudden, luminous apparition appeared before him, a radiant figure cloaked in white, surrounded by a chorus of angelic voices. The vision, described in a fragmentary letter to his patron Cangrand, spoke of a journey through realms unseen, where the soul must be judged by its deeds. Dante, shaken, wrote in the margins of his notebook, "If this is a dream, let it become a poem, for the truth of the afterlife must be given shape." Whether the vision was a literal experience, a literary device, or a symbolic representation of his inner turmoil, it served as the catalyst for a narrative that would fuse personal suffering with universal theology. The exile itself, marked by loss, longing, and political betrayal, mirrored the pilgrim's descent into darkness and ascent toward the light, turning Dante's personal crisis into a theological allegory. The second anecdote brings us to the broader ecclesiastical context. The Council of Vienne in 1315, convened by Pope Clement V, which issued a decisive decree on heresy. The council declared that any doctrine deviating from the established teachings of the Church would be deemed heretical and subject to suppression. This decree was not merely a political maneuver. It reflected a deep anxiety about maintaining doctrinal purity in an age of burgeoning intellectual inquiry. Dante, who had been excommunicated and labeled a political dissident, would have felt the weight of this decree keenly. His inclusion of heretics in the 6th circle of hell, figures like Epicurus and the Florentine heretics, can be read as both a personal condemnation and an affirmation of the council's stance. Yet paradoxically, Dante's own work pushes the boundaries of orthodoxy, inviting readers to question the very nature of divine justice. This tension between conformity and critique exemplifies the delicate balance Dante navigated between the demands of the church and the aspirations of a poet seeking truth. Critics have long argued that Dante's cosmology, rooted in medieval astronomy and theology, is outdated and thus irrelevant to contemporary thought. They point to the fact that modern physics has replaced the geocentric model with a heliocentric, then relativistic, understanding of the universe. To them, the concentric circles of hell and the celestial spheres appear as quaint relics of a pre-scientific era. However, to dismiss Dante on this basis is to overlook the symbolic function of his cosmology. The structure of his universe is not a literal claim about the physical world, it is a metaphorical map of the moral and spiritual order. When Dante writes that the darkest place is the one where love is absent, he is not describing a physical location but a condition of the soul. In this sense, the medieval cosmology serves as a narrative device that makes abstract ethical concepts tangible. Moreover, the very act of ordering sin and virtue within a hierarchical framework invites modern readers to contemplate the ways we still impose structures on moral experience, whether through legal codes, social norms, or psychological models. The relevance of Dante's cosmology, therefore, lies not in its astronomical accuracy, but in its capacity to illuminate the perennial human quest for meaning within a structured reality. A second line of criticism contends that Dante's deep theological commitments imprison his philosophical freedom, that his allegiance to church doctrine limits the scope of his inquiry. This argument suggests that by grounding his vision in Aquinas and the Summa, Dante forfeits the radical potential of poetry to imagine alternative ontologies. Yet, a closer reading reveals a more nuanced picture. Dante's engagement with the via negativa demonstrates his willingness to explore the limits of language and knowledge. When he reaches the Empyrean, he deliberately adopts apophatic language, acknowledging that the highest truth is beyond all words. In doing so, he transcends the very doctrinal boundaries that his critics claim he upholds. Furthermore, his inclusion of figures traditionally deemed heretical, such as the pagan philosophers in Limbo, signals an openness to intellectual pluralism that was daring for his time. By placing these souls in a dignified, albeit imperfect, realm, Dante questions the rigidity of salvation's criteria, suggesting that reason and virtue may hold value even outside the strict confines of Christian orthodoxy. In this way, his theological commitments become a springboard for philosophical exploration rather than a cage. To deepen our understanding, let us cross-reference Dante's theological architecture with Augustine's City of God. Augustine distinguishes between the earthly city, driven by self-love, and the heavenly city, guided by the love of God. Dante mirrors this dichotomy in his three-part structure. Inferno as the city of self-oriented sin, Purgatorio as the transitional realm of repentance, and Paradiso as the city of divine love. Augustine writes, the earthly city is marked by love of the world. The heavenly city by love of the eternal. Dante's pilgrim, guided by Virgil, the symbol of human reason, and later by Beatrice, the embodiment of divine love, traverses these realms, embodying Augustine's journey from worldly attachment to celestial communion. The influence is not merely thematic, it is structural. Both authors employ a literary topography to map theological truths, using the city as a metaphor for the soul's orientation. The influence of later scholastic debates in the 15th century further enriches this tapestry. Think of the disputes between the Via Moderna and the Via Antiqua, where thinkers like William of Ockham championed nominalism against the realism of earlier scholastics. Ockham's principle of parsimony, entities should not be multiplied beyond necessity, finds a subtle echo in Dante's economy of symbolic forms. Each circle of hell, each sphere of heaven serves a precise, necessary function. There is no superfluous ornamentation. Yet Dante does not reduce the cosmos to mere logical abstraction. He infuses it with poetic imagination, suggesting that the parsimonia of form can coexist with the richness of meaning. This dialogue between medieval logic and poetic expression illustrates how Dante anticipates the Renaissance tension between the rational and the artistic, a tension that would later be explored by figures such as Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola. Consider an analogy that may help illuminate the interplay of faith and reason in Dante's work. Imagine a grand cathedral under construction. The stones represent the rational principles of Aristotelian physics. The arches and vaults embody the theological doctrines that give the structure its purpose. The master mason Aquinas designs the blueprint, ensuring that each stone supports the next, while the mystic Pseudo-Dionysius whispers that the highest spire points toward a light that cannot be seen but must be felt. Dante the sculptor carves the figures that populate the nave and the choir, giving flesh to the abstract design. The cathedral, once completed, stands as a testament to both the material and the transcendent, inviting worshippers to walk its aisles and contemplate the divine mystery. In this analogy, the Divine Comedy is the cathedral itself, a space where reason and faith are not opposing pillars but complementary supports of a single edifice. Returning to the 9 circles, let us examine more closely the moral logic that undergirds their arrangement. The first circle, limbo, houses those who lived virtuously but lacked baptism, reflecting the medieval belief that salvation requires both grace and knowledge of the faith. Here, Dante quotes Virgil. Here the blessed who never knew the gospel are placed, not suffering, but forever longing. This longing, desiderium, becomes a motif that recurs throughout the Inferno. The souls are not tormented by fire alone, but by the acute awareness of what they have missed. In the 4th circle, the avaricious and prodigal are punished by endlessly pushing heavy weights, a vivid illustration of Aristotle's notion that excess and deficiency are both vices. The weight symbolizes the burden of material attachment, a tangible representation of an abstract moral principle. This concrete imagery is what gives Dante's cosmology its enduring power. It translates philosophical concepts into lived experience. In the Empyrean, the final destination, the language shifts from the concrete to the ineffable. Dante writes, "The love that moves the sun and the other stars is the love that moves my heart." Here, the poet's own love becomes a microcosm of the divine love that animates the cosmos. This line resonates with Augustine's claim that the love of God is the measure of all things, and with Aquinas' assertion that the ultimate end of all things is the vision of God. By aligning the pilgrim's personal longing with the universal love that sustains the heavens, Dante demonstrates that the journey is both individual and collective. The Empyrean, then, is not merely a place of reward, but a metaphysical endpoint where the soul's desire aligns perfectly with the divine will, a culmination of the via positiva, affirmative theology, and the via negativa, negative theology. Let us pause for a moment and imagine the pilgrim's ascent through the spheres as a ladder of knowledge. Each rung represents a higher degree of understanding. The moon, the realm of vows; Mercury, the sphere of ambition; Venus, the domain of love; the sun, the illumination of wisdom; Mars, the courage of fortitude; Jupiter, the justice of law; Saturn, the contemplative tranquility; the fixed stars, the unity of divine order; the primum mobile, the instant motion of the divine intellect. This latter mirrors the scholastic method of quaestio, the systematic questioning and resolution of philosophical problems. In each sphere, Dante poses a question, engages with an answer, and moves upward, just as a medieval scholar would examine a theological proposition. The ascent thus becomes a dramatized form of scholastic inquiry, with the added richness of poetic metaphor. By embedding the scholastic method within the narrative, Dante invites the listener to experience philosophy not as an abstract debate, but as an embodied pilgrimage. The Council of Vienne's decree on heresy also finds a reflective echo in the Purgatorio. In the second terrace of Purgatory, the proud are forced to carry heavy stones, a punishment that mirrors the humility demanded by the Church's insistence on orthodoxy. Yet, Dante's portrayal is nuanced. The penitent souls express genuine remorse and a desire for reconciliation, suggesting that the path to salvation is not merely the avoidance of doctrinal error, but the transformation of the heart. This subtle critique aligns with Aquinas' view that the intentio, the intention behind an act, is crucial to moral evaluation. In this way, Dante acknowledges the Council's concern for doctrinal purity while simultaneously advocating a more compassionate, interiorized approach to sin and redemption. To illustrate the living relevance of Dante's theological framework, consider a modern example: the ethical dilemmas surrounding artificial intelligence. When we design algorithms that make decisions about resource allocation, we are, in effect, constructing a new kind of cosmos, a digital sphere where choices are made according to programmed hierarchies. Dante's model of ordered sin and virtue can serve as a metaphorical guide. Just as each circle of hell reflects a specific moral disorder, each layer of an algorithmic decision-making process must be examined for biases that represent sins of the system, such as discrimination or opacity. The Empyrean then becomes an aspirational goal, a transparent, just system that aligns with the highest ethical principles, akin to the divine love that moves the sun. By applying Dante's cosmology to contemporary issues, we see that his synthesis of faith and reason continues to offer a framework for navigating complex moral landscapes. Another contemporary parallel can be drawn with environmental ethics. The medieval understanding of the cosmos placed humanity at the center of a hierarchical order, yet also emphasized stewardship of the created world, a concept rooted in Augustine's City of God and Aquinas' Law of Nature. Dante's portrayal of the natural world, rivers of fire, winds of sorrow, the shining stars, reflects a universe imbued with moral significance. In the Paradiso, the pilgrim witnesses the harmony of the spheres, a harmony that is disrupted when sin contamined the night of a cold November in 1300, when Dante Alighieri stood before the gates of the afterlife, was not merely a literary conceit but a profound meditation on the architecture of moral life. In the opening lines of the Inferno, he invites the reader and perhaps himself to confront the ultimate consequences of human choice. Lasciate ogni speranza, voici cintrate, he writes, a warning that reverberates through every circle of hell, every terrace of purgatory, and every sphere of paradise. This injunction is more than a dramatic flourish. It encapsulates Dante's conviction that the soul's destiny is bound up with the virtues it has cultivated or neglected during its earthly pilgrimage. To understand this conviction, we must trace its intellectual lineage, from the ancient ethics of Aristotle, through the synthesis of Thomas Aquinas, to the medieval notion of contrapasso that makes punishment a mirror of sin, and finally to the modern debates that question whether such a moral framework can accommodate the fluidity of human freedom. Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics laid the groundwork for a virtue-centered view of morality, insisting that the good life is a life of rational activity performed in accordance with virtue. He distinguished between moral virtues, courage, temperance, justice, and intellectual virtues such as wisdom, arguing that each virtue occupies a mean between two extremes. Dante inherits this schema, but he reorders it into a hierarchical ladder that stretches from the darkest pit of the Inferno to the luminous summit of the Empyrean. In the Divine Comedy, virtue is not an abstract quality but a concrete, lived experience that determines the soul's position in the cosmic order. The hierarchy begins with the cardinal virtues, which Dante treats as the foundation of all higher virtues, and culminates in the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity, which only the blessed can fully possess. Thomas Aquinas, writing a century after Aristotle's works were translated into Latin, infused the classical virtue ethics with a Christian teleology. Aquinas argued that virtues are habits infused by divine grace, enabling the human will to align with the ultimate good. He famously wrote, "Virtue perfects the natural powers, and the moral virtues perfect the appetites." Dante's moral universe reflects this synthesis. The souls in purgatory are engaged in a process of purification that mirrors Aquinas' view of the soul's gradual ascent toward divine likeness. The terraces of purgatory, each dedicated to a specific sin, function as a series of corrective exercises, a practical embodiment of Aquinas' claim that virtue is cultivated through repeated, intentional action. The medieval concept of contrapasso, the principle that the punishment fits the crime in a symbolic or literal way, provides the mechanical engine of Dante's moral architecture. In the eighth circle, the male bulge, the fraudulent are subjected to punishments that echo the nature of their deceit. The so-called falsari, or falsifiers, are afflicted by a relentless, corrosive disease that rots their bodies, a vivid illustration of how their lies have eroded the moral fabric of society. As Dante observes, quivi sospiri, pient e lurida voce /duna popolaziani, ca cira si grave, /gl su lamento el orecchio si move, Inferno, canto xxxiv. The very sound of their suffering becomes a lamentation that reverberates through the abyss, a reminder that falsehood corrodes not only the liar but the communal trust that holds civilization together. The ascent through the terraces of purgatory offers a counterpoint to this retributive symbolism. Here, the soul's progress is measured not by the severity of its punishment but by the incremental acquisition of virtue. On the first terrace, the proud are forced to carry heavy stones upon their backs, a physical burden that teaches humility. As they climb, the stones become lighter, symbolizing the gradual shedding of pride. On the second terrace, the envious have their eyes sewn shut, compelling them to look inward and cultivate contentment. Each terrace is an allegory for an inner transformation, a concrete illustration of how virtue can be progressively internalized. Dante's guide, the poet Virgil, explains that the soul that has been purged of its sins, through the fire of love, rises and in the light of the sun, becomes more perfect, purgatorio, canto I. This metaphorical fire is not punitive in the same sense as hell's torments. It is purgative, a cleansing that prepares the soul for the ultimate union with the divine. To appreciate the lived significance of these abstractions, we can turn to two historical anecdotes that illuminate how Dante's moral theory intersected with the politics of his own time. The first concerns the trial of Guido da Montefeltro, a seasoned warlord who, after a life of cunning strategy, entered the cloister of the Franciscan order seeking redemption. Yet when Pope Boniface VIII summoned Guido to give counsel on a deceitful plot against the Colonna family, Guido, bound by the seal of confession, offered his advice while invoking his monastic vows. In Inferno Canto XXVII, Dante places Guido among the fraudulent counselors, condemning him for violating the sanctity of his religious commitment. The episode underscores Dante's belief that moral responsibility does not dissolve in the face of political expediency. The soul is still accountable for the misuse of intellect, even when cloaked in religious guise. The second anecdote involves the political rehabilitation of the Florentine Guelphs after the tumultuous period of the Black Guelphs' exile. Dante, a Guelph himself, experienced exile firsthand when the Black Guelphs seized power in 1302, accusing him of corruption and banishment. In the Paradiso Canto II, Dante praises the eventual restoration of the White Guelphs, noting that the just will rise and the unjust will fall. Paradiso Canto II. This restoration is not merely a historical footnote. It is an affirmation of Dante's conviction that divine justice ultimately rectifies earthly injustice, rewarding virtue and punishing vice in a grand, temporal arc that mirrors the celestial order. The political rehabilitation of his factions serves as a microcosm of the larger moral schema. The world may be corrupted, but virtue, when properly cultivated, will ascend and be vindicated. The tension between predestination and human agency weaves through every canto of the comedy. On the one hand, the poem presents a universe governed by divine providence, where each soul's placement is preordained by God's omniscient judgment. Yet Dante also insists that the soul possesses free will, the capacity to choose virtue over vice, to embrace or reject divine love. In Paradiso Canto XXXII, St. Peter declares, "All things are made by the will of God, but the will of man is also a part of the divine plan." Paradiso Canto XXXII. This paradox echoes the medieval scholastic debate on the compatibility of divine foreknowledge and human freedom, a debate that finds resonance in contemporary existentialist thought. Sartre, for instance, would argue that existence precedes essence, insisting that humans are condemned to be free, forced to create their own values in an indifferent universe. Dante, however, posits that freedom is exercised within a moral framework already illuminated by divine law, a framework that offers both the possibility of redemption and the inevitability of judgment. Critics have long challenged the rigidity of Dante's moral system. One line of argument holds that the comedy imposes an inflexible hierarchy of sins that leaves little room for nuance or contextual understanding. For instance, the punishment of the fraudulent in the eighth circle treats all forms of deceit as equally reprehensible, ignoring the complex social and political pressures that may have motivated certain actions. Moreover, the notion that every sin receives a precisely calibrated punishment can be seen as a mechanistic view of justice that discounts the transformative potential of repentance. In response, defenders of Dante point to the Purgatorio as evidence that his system allows for growth and change. The very existence of a middle realm where souls undergo progressive purification suggests that Dante recognized the fluidity of moral development, that virtue can be cultivated over time, and that justice is not merely retributive but restorative. A second, more visceral critique argues that Dante's punitive symbolism glorifies a retributive model of justice that is at odds with contemporary ethical sensibilities. The graphic depictions of sinners being boiled, torn, or eternally frozen can be read as sensationalist, reinforcing a culture of fear rather than encouraging moral reflection. Yet, if we examine the Divine Comedy through the lens of modern virtue ethicists such as Philippa Foot, we discover an underlying emphasis on character formation rather than mere punishment. Foot contends that virtues are dispositions that enable individuals to act rightly, not because of external rewards or punishments, but because they are integral to a flourishing life. Dante's vivid imagery, then, can be understood as a didactic tool, a dramatic illustration designed to awaken the reader's conscience and to inspire the cultivation of virtue before the soul reaches the point of irrevocable judgment. Roscoe Hill, a contemporary scholar of virtue ethics, expands on this by suggesting that Dante's hierarchical virtues function as a moral scaffolding, a structure that guides the soul toward the ultimate good. Hill argues that the comedy offers a narrative virtue ethics, where stories of sin and redemption serve as exemplars for the cultivation of moral habits. In this view, the punishment of the fraudulent is not an endorsement of cruelty, but a narrative device that starkly contrasts the consequences of a life unmoored from virtue. The terror of the male bulge becomes a catalyst for the reader's own moral vigilance, urging a turn toward the disciplined practice of honesty, humility, and love. The philosophical conversation does not end with virtue ethics. Existentialist thinkers such as Kierkegaard have engaged with Dante's portrayal of the leap of faith, required to move from the darkness of sin toward the light of divine grace. Kierkegaardian anxiety, the dread of confronting one's own finitude, resonates with Dante's experience in the dark wood at the beginning of the Inferno. When Dante asks, Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita / mi ritrovi per una selva oscura, the Divine Comedy, Canto I, he is expressing a universal existential crisis. The feeling of being lost, of having strayed from the path of virtue. Kierkegaard would read this as the moment when the individual must confront the absurdity of existence and choose, despite uncertainty, to commit to a higher purpose. Dante's subsequent acceptance of Virgil's guidance can be interpreted as the act of embracing reason as a stepping stone toward faith, a synthesis that mirrors Kierkegaard's dialectic between the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious stages of life. The concrete examples within the comedy further illuminate the interplay of virtue, justice, and free will. Consider the punishment of the fraudulent advisors, the Simeon, who are encased in flames that burn their tongues, rendering them mute. Their sin was the perversion of counsel, the betrayal of trust for personal gain. By silencing them, Dante illustrates that the very tool they misused, speech, becomes the instrument of their suffering. This is contrapasso in its purest form. The punishment reflects the moral inversion of the sin. Yet the punishment also serves as a moral lesson to the living, a reminder that the misuse of intellect for deceit leads to a loss of the very capacity that made the deceit possible. In contrast, the ascent through the terraces of purgatory is a narrative of progressive virtue. The third terrace, dedicated to the wrathful, forces its occupants to walk through a thick, acrid smoke that chokes them, symbolizing the clouded judgment that anger produces. As they ascend, the smoke thins, representing the clearing of the mind as the soul learns patience and forgiveness. The final terrace, the earthly paradise, is reserved for those who have fully integrated the virtues of humility, charity, and divine love. Here, the souls are no longer bound by the weight of their former sins. They stand in the light of the sun, an allegory for the illumination that comes from aligning one's will with the divine will. This progressive model underscores Dante's belief that virtue is not a static attribute but a dynamic process, one that can be cultivated through disciplined practice, repentance, and the grace of God. The philosophical depth of Dante's moral framework becomes even clearer when we cross-reference his ideas with those of other medieval thinkers. For instance, the scholastic notion of the law of God, as articulated by Peter Lombard, aligns with Dante's conception of divine justice as an immutable, rational order that governs both the cosmos and the human heart. Lombard's sentences argue that the law of God is both universal and particular, applying to all beings while also addressing individual circumstances. Dante's Divine Comedy mirrors this duality. The universal structure of hell, purgatory, and paradise reflects the universal law, while the specific punishments and purifications reflect the particularities of each soul's choices. Even the ancient Stoics, with their emphasis on living in accordance with nature, find a resonant echo in Dante's insistence that the soul must align itself with the divine order. The Stoic sage who accepts fate with equanimity would recognize the inevitability of divine judgment in the comedy. Yet, unlike the Stoics who often downplay the role of external punishment, Dante insists that external consequences serve as essential mirrors that reveal the inner state of the soul. This tension between internal virtue and external justice is a hallmark of Dante's moral thought, one that continues to challenge readers to reconcile the two dimensions. The relevance of Dante's moral philosophy extends far beyond the medieval imagination. In contemporary legal theory, the principle of lex talionis, the law of retaliation, has been critiqued for its potential to perpetuate cycles of violence. Dante's contrapasso offers a nuanced alternative, punishment that is not merely retributive but educational, designed to expose the moral failure and invite reflection. Modern restorative justice movements, which emphasize repairing harm and reintegrating offenders, can find a literary predecessor in the Purgatorio, where sinners actively work to cleanse their souls and rejoin the community of the blessed. The terraces become a metaphor for rehabilitation programs that aim not just to punish, but to transform. In the realm of personal ethics, the Divine Comedy invites each reader to consider their own terraces of moral development. The metaphor of climbing a mountain, each step requiring effort, each plateau demanding introspection, mirrors contemporary self-help narratives that stress incremental growth. When Dante says, Lo maggior di tutti grave l'amor ci move il sol e l'alter stel, Paradiso, canto XXXII, he reminds us that love, the ultimate virtue, is the force that propels the soul upward. In a world where moral relativism often claims that values are fluid, Dante's insistence on an objective moral hierarchy challenges us to examine whether there truly are universal virtues that transcend cultural context. The debate over Dante's alleged rigidity can be deepened by examining the philosophical concept of moral luck, as discussed by contemporary thinkers such as Thomas Nagel. Moral luck questions whether individuals can be judged fairly for actions that are heavily influenced by circumstances beyond their control. Dante, however, appears to reject this ambiguity, assigning each soul a punishment that directly reflects the nature of their sin, irrespective of external pressures. Yet the Purgatorio suggests a more compassionate stance. The souls there are given the opportunity to rectify their moral failings, implying that Dante acknowledges the role of circumstance and the possibility of change. This dual approach, strict justice in hell, merciful correction in purgatory, offers a nuanced perspective that resists a simplistic label of rigidity. The second counterargument, that Dante glorifies retributive justice, can be addressed by looking at the poetic function of terror in moral education. Aristotle, in his Poetics, argued that tragedy evokes fear and pity to purify the audience's emotions, a process he called catharsis. Dante's vivid depictions of suffering serve a similar purpose. They arouse a visceral response that leads the reader to contemplate the consequences of moral failure. Rather than celebrating cruelty, Dante uses horror as a moral mirror, prompting self-examination. In this sense, the comedy aligns with the Aristotelian view that the emotional impact of narrative can foster ethical insight, not simply reinforce a punitive ethos. When we bring Sartre's existentialist notion of bad faith into conversation with Dante, we uncover an intriguing tension. Sartre posits that individuals often deceive themselves to avoid the anguish of absolute freedom, thereby denying their authentic self. Dante's sinners, especially those in the male bulge, can be read as embodying bad faith. They have chosen to define themselves by falsehoods, thereby surrendering authentic agency. Yet, unlike Sartre's atheistic universe, Dante offers a transcendent source of meaning that can rescue the soul from bad faith. The Divine Comedy thus becomes a dialogue between existential freedom and divine determinism, suggesting that authentic freedom is realized not in the absence of God, but through a harmonious alignment with the divine order. The philosophical conversation also extends to the modern virtue ethicist Roscoe Hill's concept of virtue narratives. Hill argues that moral development is best understood through stories that illustrate the cultivation of virtues over time. Dante's comedy is the archetype of such a narrative. It maps a soul's journey from sin to salvation, providing a template for readers. It is a quiet evening in the vaulted halls of the soul, and we find ourselves once again at the threshold of a great mystery. The relationship between knowledge and the words that carry it. In the case of Dante Alighieri, that relationship is not merely a matter of style or convenience, it is the very engine of his philosophical project. When Dante writes the highest language of the universe, he is not simply praising poetry as a lofty art. He is asserting that the poetic medium itself is a conduit for metaphysical truth, a claim that reverberates through the centuries and invites us to ask, can a structured verse bound by rhyme and meter convey what abstract treatises often fail to reach? To begin, let us recall the moment when Dante, a Florentine exile, first set foot on the road that would become the Divine Comedy. He was a man of law, a poet, a politician, and above all, a seeker of truth. His early education in the scholastic tradition gave him a solid grounding in Aristotelian logic, yet it left him yearning for a language that could articulate the ineffable. In the Paradiso, canto XXXII, he writes, "The love that moves the sun and the other stars is the same that moves the human heart, and this love is the highest language." Here the word language is not a mere metaphor. It is a metaphysical claim. Dante is suggesting that love, as the fundamental principle of the cosmos, is expressed through a language that surpasses ordinary discourse. This is the seed of his epistemology. Knowledge is not only propositional, it is also affective, rhythmic, and symbolic. The first structural example that embodies this epistemic vision is the terza rima, the interlocking three-line stanza of a ba, BCB, CDC, and so forth that Dante invented for the comedy. At first glance, it may appear as a clever poetic device, a way to bind the verses together. Yet, if we look deeper, we see a reflection of the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. Each stanza contains 3 lines, each line linked to the next by a shared rhyme, just as the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are distinct yet inseparably united. In the very architecture of his poem, Dante is modeling the unity of divine knowledge. The rhyme scheme forces the poet to think in terms of connections, to anticipate the next line, to maintain a harmonious flow. In doing so, the poet's mind mirrors the mind of God, which, according to medieval metaphysics, knows all things in a single, self-coherent act. When Dante guides us through the spheres of heaven, the terza rima becomes a cognitive scaffold, a way of structuring the ascent of the intellect. The reader following the rhyme is compelled to move forward, to anticipate, to see how each idea unfolds into the next. In this sense, the poetic form is not a decorative afterthought. It is an epistemic tool that shapes the very process of knowing. The second example, perhaps more intimate, is the figure of Beatrice, who appears first in Vita Nuova and later as the guide through the celestial realms of Paradiso. Beatrice is not simply a beloved lady, she is an allegorical embodiment of divine intellect. In Paradiso Canto II, Dante declares, "She who was my guide, the blessed lady, who leads me onward through the starry road of purest love, is she who is the truth." Beatrice, as a personified wisdom, functions as a linguistic bridge between the human mind and the divine. When she speaks, her words are infused with a light that transforms ordinary language into a luminous medium. She teaches Dante that true knowledge requires not only rational analysis but also an effective openness, a love that can receive the light of the intellect. This is why Dante insists that the poetic medium, suffused with love and beauty, can convey metaphysical truths more directly than the sterile language of scholastic disputation. The allegory of Beatrice thus becomes a living illustration of Dante's epistemology. Knowledge is a journey guided by love, and the language that carries that love is poetry itself. But why did Dante choose the vernacular Italian over the scholarly Latin that dominated his day? The answer lies in a personal encounter that shaped his political and linguistic convictions. In 1305, while still a young poet, Dante met Cangrande della Scala, the Lord of Verona, a patron of the arts and a man of formidable intellect. According to contemporary accounts, Cangrande invited Dante to his court, offering him a place among his poets. In a private conversation, Cangrande reportedly asked Dante, "Why do you write in Latin when the people of our land cannot hear your voice?" Dante, moved by the Lord's concern for the common folk, replied, "The truth must be heard by all hearts, not locked away in the cloisters of scholars." This anecdote, recorded in the Vita di Dante by Giovanni Boccaccio, illustrates a pivotal moment when Dante decided that the vernacular was the appropriate vessel for his philosophical insights. By writing in the language of the people, he democratized access to the highest truths, making the poetic medium a public epistemic instrument. The choice was both philosophical and political. It asserted that knowledge belongs to the community, not merely to the elite. The political dimension of Dante's linguistic choice, however, has been the subject of vigorous debate. Some scholars argue that Dante's adoption of the vernacular was primarily a strategic move to gain favor with powerful patrons like Cangrande, and to position himself within the volatile factional politics of Florence. They point to passages in the Divine Comedy where Dante praises the white rose of the Guelphs and condemns the black rose of the Ghibellines, suggesting that his poetic language served as a vehicle for partisan propaganda. Yet even if political motives were present, they do not diminish the epistemic potency of the vernacular. The very act of translating complex theological and philosophical concepts into everyday speech required a deep engagement with the nature of meaning. Dante had to find ways to render the ineffable, such as the concept of creatio ex nihilo, in terms that resonated with ordinary listeners. In doing so, he demonstrated that the poetic medium could bridge the gap between abstract metaphysics and lived experience, thereby reinforcing his claim that poetry is a superior conduit for knowledge. Let us now consider the first major counterargument to Dante's position, that poetic ambiguity undermines epistemic clarity. Critics have long noted that the symbolic density of the Divine Comedy leaves room for multiple interpretations, which could dilute the certainty of the truths it aims to convey. The medieval scholastic tradition prized precise definitions, syllogistic rigor, and unambiguous terminology. From that perspective, Dante's reliance on metaphor, allegory, and layered symbolism appears as a weakness. If a reader misinterprets a symbol, say, mistaking the three beasts in Inferno for mere political caricatures rather than representations of sin, does the poem still deliver the intended metaphysical insight? The concern is that the very fluidity that makes poetry resonant also makes it susceptible to misreading, thereby compromising its epistemic reliability. In response, we can draw on the insights of Ludwig Wittgenstein, particularly his later philosophy of language games. Wittgenstein argued that the meaning of a word is its use within a form of life, and that linguistic practices are rule-governed yet flexible. Applying this to Dante, the Divine Comedy can be seen as a complex language game in which symbols function as moves within a larger epistemic strategy. The ambiguity is not a flaw but a feature that invites the reader to engage actively, to negotiate meaning, and thereby to internalize the knowledge more deeply. When a reader wrestles with the symbolism of the river Lethe, for instance, they are forced to confront the nature of forgetfulness and memory, concepts central to epistemology. The act of interpretation becomes an epistemic exercise in itself. In this way, poetic ambiguity does not erode clarity, it transforms clarity into a participatory process, a dialogue between author, text, and reader. The knowledge conveyed is not a static proposition, but a living understanding that evolves with each engagement. A second counterargument focuses on the claim that Dante's linguistic choices were primarily politically motivated, and thus his philosophical claims about poetry are secondary to his partisan agenda. Some historians point to the explicit political allegories in the Purgatorio, where the souls of contemporary Florentine figures are placed in specific terraces as moral commentary on their real-world actions. They argue that Dante's use of the vernacular was a strategic tool to embed political messages within a seemingly universal framework, thereby masking partisan critique behind poetic grandeur. If this is true, then the philosophical significance of his language may be overstated. The poem would be a political pamphlet cloaked in poetic form. To address this, we can turn to Martin Heidegger's reflections on poetry as the origin of the thinking. Heidegger claimed that poetry is not a decorative addition to philosophy but its very foundation, because poetry opens the clearing where being can be disclosed. From this perspective, even if Dante's language served a political purpose, it simultaneously opened a space for ontological revelation. The political and philosophical dimensions are not mutually exclusive. Rather, they intertwine. Dante's placement of the poet Guido Guinizelli in Purgatorio Canto XXII, for example, serves both as a tribute to a literary predecessor and as a statement about the transformative power of love, an idea that resonates with both political reconciliation and metaphysical unity. The vernacular becomes a double-edged sword. It reaches the masses, it challenges the status quo, and it invites a communal contemplation of the divine. Thus, the political motives do not diminish the epistemic value. They amplify it by ensuring that the knowledge reaches those who are most in need of it. Having examined the arguments and counterarguments, let us explore how Dante's theory of knowledge through poetry finds resonance in contemporary discussions, especially in the field of narrative ethics. Narrative ethics asks how stories shape moral understanding and how the form of a narrative influences its ethical impact. Modern philosophers such as Martha Nussbaum argue that literature cultivates empathy and moral imagination, allowing us to inhabit perspectives beyond our own. Dante's Divine Comedy functions precisely in this way. By guiding the reader through the torments of sinners, the purgation of souls, and the beatific vision, the poem invites us to experience, vicariously, the consequences of ethical choices. The terza rima itself, with its interlocking rhymes, models the interconnectedness of moral actions. Each decision reverberates, affecting the next. Beatrice, as a guide, embodies the ideal of moral wisdom that leads the soul toward the good. In this sense, Dante's poetic epistemology anticipates the claim that narrative form is not merely a vehicle for moral content, but a constitutive element of moral knowledge itself. Consider a concrete modern application. The use of narrative simulations in medical ethics training. Students are presented with patient stories that unfold in a structured, yet open-ended manner, prompting them to make decisions and experience the consequences in a safe environment. The structure of these simulations often mirrors Dante's terza rima, a sequence of interlinked scenarios where each outcome influences the next, reinforcing the idea that ethical knowledge is built through relational, narrative processes. The success of such programs can be traced back to the same insight that Dante had centuries ago, that knowledge is embodied, felt, and lived, not merely abstracted. Another contemporary parallel can be found in the development of artificial intelligence language models. Researchers strive to teach machines not only syntax but also the meaning behind words, often using large corpora of literature to embed cultural and philosophical nuance. When an AI processes Dante's verses, it must grapple with layered symbolism, metaphor, and the interplay between form and content. The challenge of capturing the highest language of the universe in code echoes Dante's own challenge of expressing divine truth in human language. The ongoing debate about whether AI can truly understand poetry reflects the same tension between propositional knowledge and poetic knowing that Dante articulated. If AI can learn to interpret terza rima as a structural analogy for the Trinity, it would demonstrate a form of epistemic achievement that goes beyond mere data retrieval, a step toward the kind of embodied knowledge Dante championed. Let us now return to the historical anecdotes that illuminate Dante's personal commitment to his linguistic philosophy. The first, the encounter with Cangrande della Scala, is not merely a footnote but a turning point that crystallized Dante's belief in the power of vernacular poetry. Cangrande, a patron known for his own literary interests, recognized that the Latin elite language was a barrier to the broader populace. When he asked Dante, "Why do you hide your wisdom behind Latin?" Dante's reply, "Because the truth must be spoken to all hearts," reveals a conviction that knowledge is a communal good, and that poetry, with its melodic cadence and emotive resonance, is the most effective conduit. This encounter underscores the idea that the poetic medium is not an aesthetic luxury, but an ethical imperative, to speak truth in a language that can be heard. The second anecdote concerns Dante's exile from Florence and his subsequent composition of the Divine Comedy in the city of Ravenna. While in exile, Dante faced the harsh reality of being a political outcast, stripped of civic power, and forced to survive on the margins. Yet, in those very circumstances, he composed the most ambitious theological poem in the Italian vernacular. According to a letter attributed to the poet Guido de Pisa, Dante confided that the very act of writing in Italian was an act of defiance against the forces that sought to silence him. He wrote, "I will carve the heavens in the tongue of my people, lest the tyrants silence the voice of truth." This declaration reveals how Dante's linguistic choice was both a philosophical stance and a political act of resistance. By forging a new poetic language, he not only created a vehicle for metaphysical insight, but also reclaimed agency over his own narrative, a powerful example of how language can be both epistemic and emancipatory. In weaving these stories together, we see a pattern. Dante's epistemology is inseparable from his poetic practice. The terza rima is not merely a rhyme scheme, it is an ontological map. Beatrice is not merely a muse. She is the embodiment of divine intellect that guides the poet's mind. The vernacular is not simply a linguistic preference, it is a democratic philosophy of knowledge. The political context of his exile and his patronage relationships are not distractions, they are the crucible in which his ideas were forged. Now, let us explore some analogies that might help us grasp the depth of Dante's claim. Imagine a lighthouse on a storm-tossed sea. The light itself is a beam of pure, unfiltered energy, but it is the rotating mechanism, the lens, the gears, the timing, that determines how the light reaches distant ships. In Dante's framework, the pure metaphysical truth is the light, while poetry is the rotating lens that directs that light toward human understanding. The terza rima functions like the gear teeth, ensuring that each turn aligns precisely with the next, creating a smooth, continuous illumination. Beatrice, as the keeper of the lighthouse, adjusts the lens, focusing the light so that it can be perceived clearly by the sailor's eye. Without the poetic form, the truth would remain a static, inaccessible blaze. With it, the truth becomes a navigable beacon. Another analogy can be drawn from music. In a symphony, the composer writes notes on a page, but the true experience of the music emerges only when the orchestra interprets those notes, blending timbre, dynamics, and rhythm into a living soundscape. The written score is akin to abstract philosophical propositions. The performance, with its expressive nuances, is akin to poetry. Dante's verses, with their melodic terza rima, function like a well-orchestrated symphony, where each rhyme and meter contributes to a harmonic whole that resonates with the listener's soul. The allegorical figures, Virgil, Beatrice, the various souls, are the instruments, each bringing a distinct timbre that enriches the overall epistemic texture. Having examined these analogies, let us turn to the cross-references that situate Dante within a broader philosophical lineage. When we read Wittgenstein's later work, especially Philosophical Investigations, we encounter the notion that the meaning of a word is its use within a language game. Dante's Divine Comedy can be read as a grand language game in which the rules are the theological doctrines, the moves are the allegorical figures, and the scoring is the progressive illumination of the soul. Each canto is a turn in the game, inviting the reader to follow the rules, to recognize the patterns, and to achieve a higher score, understanding. In this sense, Dante anticipates Wittgenstein's insight that meaning is not fixed but arises from practice, from the lived engagement with language. Heidegger, in his essay Poetry, Language, Thought, argues that poetry is the origin of truth, Ursprung des Geschehens. He writes, "Only where poetry dwells does the saying of being become possible." Dante's Divine Comedy embodies this claim. By embedding theological and metaphysical concepts within a poetic framework, Dante opens a clearing, Lichtung, where the being of God can be disclosed. The terza rima is not a decorative constraint, but a way of opening that clearing, allowing the reader to encounter the divine in a way that abstract scholastic language cannot. Heidegger's later engagement with the poetry of Hölderlin and Rilke mirrors Dante's earlier synthesis of poetic form and philosophical content, suggesting a continuity of thought that stretches across the ages. In contemporary philosophy of language, scholars such imagine, for a moment, the echo of a medieval poet's voice reverberating through the corridors of modern thought. Dante Alighieri, the Florentine troubadour of the 13th century, once mapped the soul's journey through the infernal, the purgatorial, and the celestial. Yet his cartography was never meant to remain a static artifact locked behind the vaults of the Middle Ages. From the fevered cosmologies of Giordano Bruno to the Dionysian roar of Nietzsche, to the quiet, phenomenological murmurs of Heidegger, Dante's verses have been read, reread, and reshaped as a living dialogue that stretches across centuries. In this segment, we will trace that afterlife, following the threads that bind his medieval vision to the pulse of contemporary philosophy, to the corridors of criminal justice reform, and to the green horizons of environmental ethics. We will hear the stories of nations that have claimed him as a symbol, of psychologists who have turned his infernal circles into maps of the unconscious, and we will confront the stubborn critiques that claim his medieval scaffolding cannot sustain the weight of postmodern pluralism or secular morality. All the while, we will listen to the words that have survived the ages, the verses that still whisper, "Lasciate ogni speranza, voi ch intrate, abandon all hope," ye who enter and ask whether hope, after all, is the very bridge that connects Dante's world to ours. Let us begin with the first modern mind that dared to look beyond the literal scaffolding of Dante's cosmology, and to imagine a universe that expands far beyond the geocentric heavens of the Divine Comedy. Giordano Bruno, the flamboyant philosopher-astronomer of the late 16th century, found in Dante a language that could articulate his own radical vision of an infinite cosmos. Bruno, exiled from the University of Padua for his heretical ideas, turned to Dante's Paradiso as a poetic template for his own cosmological imagination. In his De L'Infinito, Universo e Mondi 1584, Bruno writes, "The heavens are not a single sphere, but an infinite series of worlds, each like a star, each containing its own beings." He saw in Dante's ascent through the celestial spheres a metaphor for an ever-expanding, boundless universe. Bruno's correspondence with the poet's text is not merely decorative, it is a philosophical maneuver. By invoking the Empyrean as a symbol of the ultimate unity of all things, Bruno reinterpreted the medieval hierarchy of angels as a precursor to a modern, immanent network of interrelated worlds. In this way, Dante's cosmology becomes a scaffold upon which Bruno builds a vision of infinite multiplicity, a vision that prefigures the modern scientific understanding of a universe without center, without edge. The dialogue between Dante and Bruno is not a simple hand-off of ideas. It is a conversation across time that reveals the elasticity of Dante's thought. When Bruno declares the infinite is the true nature of God, not a finite closed circle, he is, in a sense, echoing Dante's own assertion in Paradiso Canto XXXII that the love that moves the sun and the other stars, amor chi move il sol e l'alter stel, is an all-encompassing force. Both poets, though separated by a century and a half, converge on the notion that love, or amor, is the dynamic principle that binds the cosmos. Bruno's secular appropriation of this principle, however, strips it of its theological trappings, recasting it as a natural law. This reinterpretation becomes a key pivot point for later philosophers who would wrestle with the tension between the sacred and the secular in Dante's work. Fast forward to the late 19th century, when Friedrich Nietzsche, the German provocateur, discovers Dante not in the quiet chambers of a monastery, but in the throes of his own Dionysian crisis. Nietzsche's reading of the Divine Comedy is famously ambivalent. In his notebooks, he scribbles, "Dante, the ultimate tragic poet, who makes the abyss of the inferno a stage for the affirmation of life." For Nietzsche, the inferno is not merely a punishment of sinners, but a crucible where the will to power is tested. He sees in the poet's relentless descent a mirror of his own philosophy of eternal recurrence, the idea that existence is a cycle of becoming, of falling and rising again. The Purgatorio, with its ladder of penitence, becomes, for Nietzsche, a symbol of the Übermensch's ascent, an individual who, through self-overcoming, transcends the moral constraints of society. Nietzsche's Dionysian reading also brings to light a counter-argument that would later become a central critique of Dante's relevance. The claim that his medieval framework, rooted in a hierarchical, theologically ordained cosmos, cannot accommodate the fluid, pluralistic values of modernity. Nietzsche's own philosophy is a revolt against the very order that Dante enshrines. Yet, paradoxically, Nietzsche's admiration for Dante's artistic mastery suggests that the poet's structural rigor can be reappropriated to serve a radically different ethical project. This tension between reverence and rebellion will echo in the 20th century engagements with Dante, most notably in the work of Martin Heidegger. Heidegger's Dante lectures, delivered in the early 1930s, are a masterclass in phenomenological exegesis. Heidegger does not merely read Dante, he listens to the poet's being as an ontological event. In his lecture, The Origin of the Work of Art, Heidegger famously writes, Dante's Divine Comedy is the first work in which the world is made visible as a work of art. For Heidegger, the Divine Comedy is not a theological treatise but an ontological unveiling, a aletheia, a truth that discloses the being of the world. He interprets the Inferno as a manifestation of Juerfenheit, the thrownness of Dasein, while the Paradiso represents the Gelassenheit, the letting go that opens the horizon of Eranes, the event of appropriation. In this reading, Dante's moral architecture becomes a map of existential possibilities, a way to navigate the tension between thrownness and authenticity. Heidegger's phenomenology also provides a bridge to contemporary movements such as post-structuralism. Think of Jacques Derrida's deconstruction of the Divine Comedy in his essay, The Gift of Death. Derrida, while not directly engaging with Dante in the same depth as Heidegger, uses the poem as a site to explore the paradox of the gift, both a blessing and a burden. He asks, is the promise of salvation in the Paradiso a gift that simultaneously imposes a limit on freedom? This question reverberates through contemporary debates on agency, responsibility, and the limits of ethical frameworks. In this sense, Dante's work becomes a fertile ground for the post-structuralist project of interrogating the conditions of meaning itself. Now, let us step out of the academic halls and into the bustling streets of contemporary society, where Dante's moral architecture is being invoked in unexpected arenas. One of the most striking modern applications appears in the ongoing debates over criminal justice reform. Across the United States and Europe, policymakers and activists have begun to reference the Divine Comedy as a moral compass for reimagining punishment and rehabilitation. The argument runs as follows: Dante's Inferno presents a spectrum of sins, each matched with a fitting contrapasso, an appropriate punishment that mirrors the nature of the transgression. Yet, crucially, Dante does not merely condemn. He also offers a path toward redemption in the Purgatorio. This dual structure of retributive justice and restorative possibility has been harnessed by reformers who argue that a just penal system should balance accountability with the opportunity for moral transformation. Take, for example, the recent legislative proposal in the state of Oregon, which seeks to replace mandatory minimum sentences for non-violent drug offenses with a tiered system that incorporates restorative practices. The bill's preamble quotes Dante. In the middle of the path of our life, I found myself in a dark wood, for the straight way had been lost. The legislators argue that, like Dante's lost traveler, many offenders have strayed from the path due to structural inequities, and that the justice system must provide a purgatorial space where individuals can work through their misdeeds, rather than consign them forever to the inferno of mass incarceration. Critics of this approach claim that borrowing from a medieval theological text is anachronistic, but supporters counter that Dante's nuanced view of sin, recognizing both the gravity of wrongdoing and the possibility of repentance, offers a timeless ethical framework that can be secularized and adapted to modern jurisprudence. A second contemporary example lies in the realm of environmental ethics, where Dante's cosmological symbolism has been reimagined as a poetic articulation of ecological interconnectedness. In Paradiso, the poet describes the Empyrean as a boundless light that unites all souls, a metaphor that resonates powerfully with the modern concept of the biosphere as an integrated living system. Eco-philosophers such as Timothy Morton have drawn on Dante's imagery to argue for a hyper-object view of the planet, an entity so vast that it transcends ordinary perception, yet whose existence is felt in every localized action. Morton writes, the Paradiso teaches us that the divine light is not a distant, abstract principle, but a luminous network that permeates every corner of creation. By invoking Dante's celestial spheres, contemporary environmental activists craft a narrative that frames ecological stewardship not merely as a policy choice, but as a moral imperative rooted in a shared cosmic heritage. Consider the 2022 United Nations Climate Conference, where a panel of philosophers and climate scientists opened their session with a reading from Paradiso Canto XXXII. The love that moves the sun and the other stars. The speaker, a philosopher of eco-justice, argued that this line encapsulates the relational ethic necessary for addressing climate change. Love as a dynamic force that binds humanity to the natural world. In this reading, Dante's medieval theology is stripped of its scholastic trappings and recast as a secular, relational ethic that emphasizes interdependence. Critics who view Dante's theological underpinnings as incompatible with secular environmentalism respond by pointing to the poem's rich allegorical layers, which allow for a reinterpretation of amor as a universal principle rather than a strictly divine command. The resonance of Dante's ideas in modern thought is not limited to policy debates. It also surfaces in the symbolic narratives of nations. In 1865, as Italy moved toward unification under the leadership of Victor Emmanuel II, Dante was summoned as a unifying emblem. The newly formed Kingdom of Italy adopted Dante's image, his likeness placed on stamps, his verses inscribed on public monuments, as a cultural touchstone that linked the fragmented city-states to a shared literary heritage. The poet's exile, his longing for just Florence, and his vision of a unified cosmos were read as metaphors for the Italian quest for political unity. A famous speech by the statesman Alessandro Manzoni proclaimed, "Dante is the soul of Italy." His Divine Comedy is the map that guides our nation from the darkness of division to the light of unity. This invocation demonstrates how Dante's philosophical narrative can be mobilized as a political symbol, a narrative that transcends the boundaries of literary criticism and enters the realm of collective identity. A second anecdote, equally vivid, comes from the psychoanalytic reinterpretation of the Inferno by Carl Jung in the early 20th century. Jung, fascinated by the archetypal imagery that permeates Dante's vision of hell, saw the Inferno as a collective unconscious map of the shadow self. In his essay, The Archetypes of the Inferno, Jung writes, Dante's circles are not merely punishments. They are projections of the inner psychic structures that we deny. He identified each circle with a specific archetype, e.g., the circle of the wrathful corresponds to the terrible mother archetype, the circle of the fraudulent aligns with the trickster, and argued that confronting these archetypes is essential for individuation. Jung's reading opened a new avenue for interpreting Dante's moral geography as a psychological journey, one that resonates with contemporary therapeutic practices that emphasize shadow work and integration. This psychoanalytic lens also feeds into modern discussions of moral responsibility, suggesting that the Inferno can be read not just as a punitive afterlife, but as a symbolic representation of the inner consequences of unintegrated aspects of the self. These historical anecdotes illustrate how Dante's work has been repeatedly recontextualized to meet the needs of different eras. Yet, as we celebrate this adaptability, we must also confront the robust counter-arguments that challenge the relevance of a medieval poet in a postmodern world. The first critique asserts that Dante's hierarchical cosmology, an ordered universe of God, angels, and souls arranged in a strict vertical axis, cannot accommodate the pluralistic, decentralized sensibilities of contemporary thought. Post-structuralist thinkers such as Mitchell Foucault would argue that any system that imposes a singular, totalizing narrative inevitably marginalizes alternative voices. From this perspective, Dante's Divine Comedy might be seen as a grand meta-narrative that silences dissenting epistemologies, an imposition of a singular moral order that conflicts with the multiplicity of modern identities. In response, defenders of Dante point to the poem's inherent polyphony. While the overall structure is hierarchical, the Divine Comedy is populated by a chorus of diverse voices, poets, philosophers, sinners, saints, each offering a distinct perspective on justice, love, and destiny. Moreover, the very act of the pilgrim's journey is one of questioning and dialogue. Dante the pilgrim constantly interrogates his guides, from Virgil to Beatrice, and even the souls he encounters. This dialogic quality aligns with contemporary ideas of dialogical ethics, as articulated by philosophers like Emmanuel Levinas, who emphasize the ethical primacy of the other. By foregrounding the encounter with the other, Dante anticipates a relational ethic that can be reinterpreted within a pluralistic framework. The hierarchy then becomes less a rigid ladder and more a scaffold for an ongoing conversation about moral meaning. The second critique focuses on Dante's theological foundations, arguing that a moral system grounded in divine revelation cannot be reconciled with secular ethics. Critics contend that Dante's conception of justice is inseparable from the Christian doctrine of sin and redemption, and that any attempt to extract a secular moral code from his work inevitably strips it of its essential meaning. This objection is especially potent in societies that have embraced secular humanism as a guiding principle. Yet, the very process of secular appropriation demonstrates the dynamism of Dante's thought. As we have seen in the criminal justice reform example, legislators have extracted the contrapasso principle, punishment that reflects the nature of the crime, and reframed it in a secular context of restorative justice. Similarly, environmental ethicists have taken the Paradeisos vision of interconnected light and recast it as an ecological principle of interdependence, devoid of explicit theological reference. Moreover, the philosophical tradition of natural law, as developed by Thomas Aquinas and later secularized by John Finney's, shows that theological concepts can be translated into rational, universal principles. Dante's articulation of amor as the moving force of the cosmos can be understood, in a secular guise, as a metaphor for the relational dynamics that undergird human societies and ecosystems alike. In this sense, the theological scaffolding does not imprison Dante's ideas. It provides a rich symbolic language that can be reinterpreted to serve contemporary ethical projects. To deepen this discussion, let us consider how Dante's legacy intersects with three major contemporary philosophical movements: post-structuralism, eco-philosophy, and the resurgence of virtue ethics in public policy. Post-structuralism, with its skepticism toward grand narratives, might appear at odds with Dante's sweeping cosmology. Yet, the deconstructionist approach can be applied to the Divine Comedy to reveal the internal tensions and aporias that undermine its apparent unity. For instance, the Inferno's emphasis on divine justice coexists with moments of compassion, such as when Dante spares the soul of the sinner who repents. This tension can be read as a destabilization of the totalizing moral order, a space where alternative readings, perhaps feminist, queer, or post-colonial, can emerge. Scholars like Gayatri Spivak have suggested that Dante's text, when examined through a post-colonial lens, reveals the marginalization of non-Christian voices, such as the Saracens and Jews who populate the Inferno's early circles. By foregrounding these silences, post-structuralist critique does not dismiss Dante's relevance, but invites a reimagining of his moral architecture that is inclusive of diverse experiences. Eco-philosophy, on the other hand, finds in Dante a poetic precursor to contemporary ecological thought. The Paradeisos depiction of the celestial spheres as a harmonious, interlocking system mirrors the modern concept of the Earth as a complex, self-regulating system. The philosopher Arnis, founder of deep ecology, might have appreciated Dante's reverence for the light that pervades all levels of existence. In a recent symposium on literature and ecology, a panelist quoted Dante's line from Paradeiso Canto I, "The love that moves the sun and the other stars." She argued that this love is not a distant, anthropocentric sentiment, but an immanent force that binds all life. By interpreting Dante's amor as an ecological principle, we can articulate a moral imperative that transcends human-centered ethics and embraces planetary stewardship. This reinterpretation dovetails with the growing field of eco-virtue ethics, which seeks to cultivate